One of the verses from the Bible that has always resonated with me is Romans 8:28, which says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." Another verse that has stood out to me is 1 Thessalonians 5:18, which states, "In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you." These verses have been both comforting and challenging for me. Comforting because it says God works for the good in all things, but difficult because it says, "In everything give thanks." Does this mean that I should give thanks for having narcissistic parents because it ultimately worked for the good in some way? I've come across sermons where these verses are interpreted to suggest that we should express gratitude for abuse and difficult circumstances because they could ultimately result in something positive. Do you think this interpretation aligns with God's intentions, or do you have a different perspective? If Romans 8:28 and 1 Thess 5:18 were written to me, a Christian living in Northern Europe in the 21st century, the answer would be yes. I should give thanks for having narcissistic parents because it ultimately worked for the good in some way. If Romans 8:28 and 1 Thess 5:18 had not been written to me, the answer would be no, because Paul did not have me and my situation in mind. He wrote to a congregation living in a different culture, struggling with specific problems and speaking an entirely different language. If you read 1 Thess 5:18 in Greek, a more appropriate translation would be "always give thanks," not "in everything give thanks." Do you see the difference? So, if we are not to give thanks for everything or everything, what will we be grateful for? This brings us back to Romans 8:28. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." If you read Romans 8:28 in Greek, a more appropriate translation would be, "We know that God always works things out for those who love Him, those who have been called to live out His will." The Bible wasn't written specifically for Christians living in the 21st century, so I don't feel obligated to give thanks for having narcissistic parents. Similarly, you are not obliged to give thanks for the challenging experiences you have been through. Even though the Bible was not written for us, that does not mean it is irrelevant. It is highly relevant and essential for a Christian living in the 21st century. What is the message in Romans 8:28 and 1? There's 5:18 for us Christians living in the 21st century? The critical point in both verses is this: if you love God, He will always work things out for you, so you should always give thanks. What does loving God mean? The answer is in 1 John 5:2, by keeping His commandments. When you read this in Greek, it says, by doing His law. This is what Jesus says in John 14:15. "If you love me, you show your love for me by living the way I taught you." What did Jesus teach? Matt 23. "When the Pharisees teach you how to obey Moses, you listen and do what they say." So, if we read the Bible as if it was not written to us, we know we are to love God by living after the terms of the Torah. And if we live by the Torah, we always have good reason to give thanks no matter what happens to us. Because, as Jesus says in Matthew, those who keep the covenant have no reason to worry about anything because Jehovah will work things out for you. Romans 8:28 and 1. Thessalonians 5:18 are some of my favorite verses because they remind me of what I see daily. If I keep the covenant and live by the Torah, I believe that Jehovah will always work things out for me, one way or the other. I trust this is true, so I thank Jehovah for resolving my situation before I see it happen. For example, if I need healing, I thank Him for healing me before I see it happen. If I need money, I thank Him for providing it for me before I see it happen. This is because I know from personal experience that it will happen.